Rollins.
Welcome back to Cohort W. I am your Season 3 host, CW3 Susie Albert. Today for Episode 9, WO1 David Hallmark talks about cultural and generational changes in leadership perspectives. He discusses how he navigates disagreements productively and how he engages in building values-based cultures. He talks about some tools that have assisted in navigating these hard discussions, specifically in framing these conversations as DAVS, which we refer to as DAVs throughout the podcast, which is description of what exists, analysis of why it exists, vision of perfection, and a strategy from how to get from the description or what exists today to the vision, which is what is perfection. He also discusses API, APIE, which is how to analyze a problem, plan, implement, and evaluate. And we discuss sort of a health model and a health mindset, some resilience lessons that he has learned in warrant officership, planning and preparing, and of course, overcoming obstacles. And lastly, and I think most importantly, we discuss how to distinguish between the difference of failure and quitting and the need to find in yourself the ability to distinguish between the two. So let's hear from Mr. Hallmark.
I am WO1 David Hallmark from a reserve unit in Wisconsin.
I understand that you are about to come up on your second year anniversary of your appointment. So you are getting close, about 3 months away from?
About that, yes. End of September it should be.
Okay, that's wonderful. Very cool. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Preemptive congratulations for your promotion. Well, I received an email from you a couple months ago kind of highlighting what the last really year and a half of your experience has been transitioning from being an NCO through the process of becoming a warrant officer and then now traversing your first year and a half of warrant officership. So I do want to ask you, do you have any tools that has helped you get through this last year and a half and has helped you feel successful and prepared and like you are contributing in the ways that you envision for yourself as a warrant officer?
Well, yeah, as I may have mentioned in my email, there's particular tools that we talked about in our one-on-ones and group discussions at walks with the DAVs, the DAVES, the description, analysis, vision, and strategy, and then APIE, analysis, plan, implement, and evaluate. I had never heard of those before walks or anything like that. So I found that very helpful in transitioning back into my unit and having kind of a guide almost or steps I can take to help me talk to people who were previously my leaders, and now I am their leader. So it was a weird switch to go back. So having those kind of tools to help me sort of frame out how we were going to interact was incredibly helpful, and I use them regularly, almost to the point now where I do it unconsciously.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and so I'm recalling when we first talked about these things, the way that we had framed the acronym DAVs, and you went over this, description, analysis, vision, and strategy, was that we were discussing ways to navigate philosophical differences or almost like disagreements or arguments or, whatever, just conflict that naturally arises in the military and in decision making and different styles of leadership. But what we were talking about is the description, what exists today, the analysis of why it exists, and maybe some deeper meaning behind it, the vision of what is perfection, and then the strategy or how we can get from what exists today, the description, to the vision of perfection throughout that entire process. It's sort of like a blueprint for holding conversations that kind of gives you a simplified way of not only communicating how you envision an issue, but also recognizing that usually it's you aren't 100% disagreeing with somebody else and they're not 100% disagreeing with you. It's usually that you have like a different strategy or maybe a different analysis, but you can find those elements that you also agree on within those 4 categories of information.
Exactly.
Do you have an example of like ways that you have used that and it has been successful for traversing that conflict or that disagreement?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and we're still working on it now, but I think the biggest example of particularly a difference in vision and strategy is we're at this sort of precipice of the military as a whole, where there's a difference in like that old school versus new school NCO mentality. Where you have all these senior NCOs who joined the Army, 20 years ago at the kind of the middle or the beginning of the surge for GWOT. And there's this idea that you have to be hard and you have to be tough on junior enlisted and, it's my way or the highway kind of thing. Whereas now we're seeing more of a difference in those junior enlisted coming in, and they very much want to feel a purpose behind what they're doing. So they want to know the why, and they want to know why we're doing this. So there's this, we're struggling now with, senior NCOs where they're like, don't ask why, just do what I'm telling you to do. And these specialists who are like, well, I'm not just going to do it. I need to know why I'm doing it and why it's important. So myself coming in or coming back as a warrant officer, I very much can see the value in, letting the junior enlisted know that they are important and what they're doing does have meaning. So sitting down with my senior NCOs and my platoon sergeants, it's trying to find that middle ground where we're like, hey, I understand where you're coming from. They do need to follow what you're telling them, but you need to realize that it's not 2008. It's not, we're 2024. The culture is different and we're shifting. You need to shift with that. So what can we do to find that sort of middle ground where, they understand that they need to follow those rules that you're setting, but you also need to talk to them like they're people. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, you bring up so many great points about like the concept of respect. I think that like back 20 years ago, and I'll even like speak from my own experience when I first came in over 17 years ago, that like there was very much like a do this, and time is of the essence or it will literally kill you, right? There was this functionality behind that, like the very direct orders and the limited information and just like, go execute. And now where I'm at in my career, and I see with like the end of the global war on terrorism, right? I see with these like big changes and us going from, the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations that we all really like cut our teeth on, those of us that are more senior now. And we're very successful. And now that we're at this point, like clearly we did stay alive, like we made decisions that enabled our own survival and enabled, collecting lessons learned. But I was in this meeting and I was asking like, man, we have too many requirements and not enough resources. How can we kind of create some solutions for this issue of like burnout? And somebody told me, they were like, well, you just need to embrace the suck. And I was like, yeah, I had definitely understood that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But right now, there is no purpose. Like it just kind of like sucks to suck for like the sake of sucking. And I was like, but is this functional? Like, is this truly the most functional environment rather than sitting down and saying, like, how do they have realistic leadership development opportunities rather than us just like continuing to do the same things that were functional and necessary before, but maybe we've grown past. And that shifting conversation of like, embrace the suck was like, just get it done was totally utilitarian. And now I'm kind of seeing like, maybe not so much.
Yeah, it's really, it is definitely something that I'm seeing a huge shift with. And it's what we've done, well, my unit particularly, is we've shifted a lot of those senior NCOs into other, more of a mentor role versus a direct leadership role. So we have our platoon is set up where, there's two E7 positions in the leadership, and one of them's more of a technical while the other one's the platoon sergeant.
Sure.
So, particularly in my platoon, I've shifted the E7 we have into the more of that technical expert role. And we pulled, a staff sergeant up into the platoon sergeant role to build confidence, because they're going to be an E7 eventually, and they're going to be that sergeant first class who's in charge of the platoon. And it's better to do that in a garrison environment versus throwing them out in the field and all of a sudden now they're in charge of platoon. They have no idea what they're doing.
Right.
And building that confidence and empowering those junior NCOs to make those kinds of decisions in a safe environment that isn't as high stakes.
Sure.
So that's what we're trying to do with that, particularly now. Well, hopefully it's going to pay a lot more dividends with a PME requirement change. So now we're seeing E5s and E6s being rapidly promoted. I definitely want to try to build that environment where they have a safe place to learn their role as a leader without the pressure of what we experienced coming up through the ranks during GWAT.
Yeah, I really love that you bring up, like, you're sort of prioritizing learning for learning's sake, right? Like for safety's sake, rather than like, I don't know. I think it requires a vigilance to kind of stave off laziness, right? To like meaningfully train and to meaningfully give feedback requires a ton of effort and planning and like management of resources versus, right, what used to be a pretty rapid churn of deployments like back to back or training opportunities, right? Where it was kind of like go and like trial by fire. And that requires just so much effort. And I hear you saying that you really want to like put meaning into that training and into those opportunities that creates the best possible outcome when they're faced with those circumstances in a war environment or like an armed conflict type of environment.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure, like when you ask somebody like, hey, tell me some of the like disagreements you've traversed over the last like year and a half of your life. It just could have taken on so many different flavors. And I really appreciate that yours is like revolving so strongly around values. And I know you to be that way. I know that to be your strong suit. But I love that, like, really what you brought up was, like, how are we more effective as a fighting force? And how do we recenter better with, like, values as a part of our vision?
Yeah, I feel very strongly that, building those core values, whether they're Army values or personal values, having that strong foundation is really what's going to take you further. I mean, MOS skills you can learn. You can practice, you can get better at through training. But values are much harder to teach because you grow up with them. So if you have people coming in that don't share the same values as you can't really replace their values because they're personal. So you have to sort of build a culture around the values you want to see and hope that people embrace that and makes the whole unit better as a whole.
Yeah, and that speaks to like the mentorship that you're implementing at your unit too, right? Like recognizing that like people are definitely allowed to be different, but really creating a healthy environment and a healthy culture is like, gosh, that's another thing that requires so much effort and so much vigilance, because it's just easy to disengage from those processes because it also can be like kind of stressful. Speaking from experience, it can be pretty stressful trying to, establish changes in an environment, especially. So I appreciate that you said that. And so another thing that you brought up was, I call it API, but assessment or analysis, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And I'm so tickled that you brought up that acronym, because so as an aside, right, ADP 5-0 talks about the operations process, and a more military term for this would be ADDIE. But the term that I use, API, is not only less of an acronym, it's a shorter acronym, but it comes from like a health mindset. So it actually comes from like health education philosophy. And what I noticed as a leader is that when I took a stance that was more like all of us are seeking our own best health in like the like mental state that we employ throughout problem solving, right? The mental state that we employ while we are learning or while we're failing, right? Or while we're deployed or our resilience. And so I kind of started changing the way that I thought probably about 5 years ago, from being like, am I loyal, or, like, is everyone respectful, or do we have self-service, to being like, hey, we can always be healthier in our values and healthier in our skills. Have you used this in the last year and a half?
I have, to an extent, and I incorporate a lot with MDMP and other problem solving that the military gives you. I also attended MRT,
Yeah.
and I found it really useful for that. So I do use a lot. I think it's helpful in sort of cyclic thinking, because it's in itself its own loop. So as you're trying to solve a problem, you're looking at how that problem's going, what you're doing to help solve it, and if it's working, reevaluating and trying something new. So it kind of goes hand in hand with that, as far as MRT goes, like a resiliency and being able to just bounce back from the hurdles that you run into.
Yeah. And speaking of obstacles, you and I had talked about a book that you had really leaned into reading early on, called The Obstacle is the Way. And I was wondering if you could, in the sort of lens of the MRT training that you have gained since being a warrant officer, your transition to a greater sphere of influence as a warrant officer, and in the context of that book, what skills do you feel like you have gleaned that have helped you to kind of traverse those obstacles, change your mindset about obstacles, or I guess just be successful in general?
The book, Obstacles Way, covers a lot of different things. The one really that resonated the most with me, there's a chapter about finding opportunity, and what it really focuses on is finding opportunity essentially in adversity. So reframing problems that you run into in a way that isn't the end of the world, but just an opportunity to try a different way. So while you might say trying to go to a school in the military, for example, and you can't get to school, or maybe you get to the school and you don't make it through the selection process and they send you back. Instead of letting that get to you and being like, well, I mean, now I'm never going to be able to go through that school. Well, that's not really a healthy mentality. So really, you got to reframe it in a way that's like, okay, well, I didn't get to the school because of X, Y, Z. Maybe I wasn't able to pass that ACFT, my run was too slow, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So it's not really so much you failed to get in that school. It's now you know where your shortfalls are physically, so now you know what to train for. So it's just reframing that problem in a way that's more of an opportunity for personal growth.
Yeah, I really like that, because I think like any information, and that's what you're talking about, it's like, yeah, you got information that's like hurtful, but any information can become your superpower, right? It's a thing that can make you unstoppable. And I think that mindset really is something that contributes to that. You remind me of this other writing that I really like. It's really a published online article by Henry Rollins, and it's called Iron in the Soul. And I've been reflecting on this lately. And you and I actually haven't talked in the last year and a half. I've had a really challenging year and a half with some unexpected health issues. And I think you know that I like kind of dropped my whole life and went active duty in my late 30s, which is like just a crazy thing to do. Anyway, and I moved down here to Fort Novacell and really like just changed a lot of things about my life very quickly. And something that I used to love when I was coaching, and I used to reference when I was coaching, has recently become relevant to me as I'm sort of traversing my own obstacles. And in Iron in the Soul, Henry Rollins is specifically discussing working out and how he found resilience through choosing hardship. So like walking into the gym and choosing to like have to contend with something that felt stronger than you, and how over time, and one of the quotes that he uses is, that with which you work, you come to resemble. And specifically, he's talking about in the context of his article, the iron. And lately, I've been really thinking about that because I've been reflecting as I sort of careen in the direction of retirement. Like I've been like, gosh, who do I surround myself with? And I'm lucky enough. I really am a really incredibly lucky CW3 to say it's a ton of warrant officers and a ton of warrant officer candidates. Like, so that with which I work, I like truly do hope to resemble like that innovation and that creativity and that resilience and stuff. And then I've also had to kind of take a look at like, have I been applying that to the hardships that I face? Whether it is as an instructor, right? Like maybe the students aren't learning from me, and I have to ask myself, like, well, am I a good enough teacher? Am I a good enough leader to be flexible enough to teach it another way so that they can understand it? And like really holding that accountability in myself. So I appreciate that you brought up that book, because I'm going to revisit it, and I'm going to like recenter on some of these things, because I think that they're always relevant, certainly to warrant authorships, because innovation is like such a big part of what we do. And sometimes with the isolation that comes with warrant authorship, you got to really count on yourself and have a solid resilience. Does that resonate with your experience, or have you had different experiences over the last year and a half?
No, that's really accurate. You know, they tell you going through walks that, you know, warrant officer 1 is the loneliest rank. And you kind of don't really know what it means until you actually are appointed, and then you get back to wherever your first duty station is. And then you realize, yeah, it really kind of is, because you're not quite separated from the NCO Corps yet, but you're separated enough that you don't feel like you can really go back to it. The people you had relationships with there, particularly in Compo 2 and 3, because we were together for so long, you know, I have to be very cognizant of how I interact with people who, you know, a year and a half ago were my peers, and now they're my subordinates.
Sure.
Likewise, I'm not quite at the same level of the CW3, CW4s that I'm around all the time. So it is really, it's a very lonely rank. You're the,
yeah.
You outrank every enlisted, but you're outranked by every other officer. So
it's crazy. Yeah. And I very specifically remember with your squad, when you came through, I was talking about like how isolation is like a privilege. Like you don't have to people please anyone ever. Like there's like really no requirement to like fit into a team as a warrant officer. But there also is like sometimes a painful isolation of like, especially when you're problem solving and you need somebody to like bounce ideas off of. Right. And that's one of the reasons why I rely very heavily on the cohort, like people that I'm not necessarily co-located with all the time, but people that I know and trust within the cohort. Do you feel like you've made connections within the cohort? Do you have somebody that you could call if you're like, hey, is this a good idea? Or like, hey, can we talk through this problem that I'm facing?
I do. I feel like it's particularly during WOBIC, is when they pushed a lot of networking. Say, hey, this is going to be really important. You know, WOBIC's a little different because obviously it's MOS specific. So a lot of my network at WOBIC was all people in my job field, but it really kind of laid the foundation of the importance of networking. So when you come back and you're talking to your other warrant officers that are in your field, they also have networks that they've built over their careers. And even if I don't have a specific connection for a particular thing, they probably do. So I can reach out to them like, hey, this is the problem I'm having. What do you think? Or do you know what we can do? And 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, oh, yeah, I know a guy. So that's like the warrant officer thing is, hey, I know a guy. Yeah, let me get you in contact with them. Let me get you their number. I'll let them know you're calling. And it goes from there. So I've been really, really fortunate in that respect, in that the other warrant officers in my company have been around for a really long time, and they have really deep connections. So I have been lucky in that regard.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it is like designed that way to be insular, because there is like such an isolation. And I was actually talking to a retired CW5 today, and the most incredible thing that he kept saying over and over was like, man, like God bless the new generation. Like, wow, like we really got to take care of the new generation. And I just thought it was such a cool message that like that institutional knowledge lives on through our connections. Like sure, through doctrine, absolutely. But like certainly through the strength in our connections and our ability to like reach out and be like, dang, do you got any ideas for this? Or like, hey, am I crazy? But I actually make a lot of those phone calls to be like, man, like really check me on this thing. Like, am I off base? And it's helpful to have people that are also trusted advisors that can sit down and like, you know, kind of pick apart your ideas and find if they can strengthen it in any way. So I'm definitely glad you have access to those people.
Yeah, and I think that's also another big advantage of Compo 2 and 3, especially the RTI. I'm really glad I did the RTI versus going to Novacell for the active duty walks, just because I still talk to those people. Nice. So all the people I went to walks with, they all are in the Wisconsin National Guard. So they're still pretty local. So, and we're all different MOS, so we're all different fields. So I still have those particular connections, and we still talk pretty regularly.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up because I have worked both programs, right? So like, hey, within both programs, not just like having working knowledge of, but I was a TAC for the RTI program, and then I was a TAC out here for a year, and now I teach academics out here. But I always say, so it's funny that we're talking about DAS, but I always say same vision, different strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Like the vision is that you have WO1s that are appointed and are prepared for their technical affiliation and to enter, back into an operational unit. And then the strategy, right, is that out here, it's 5 weeks, like no kidding, like you don't get your cell phone for a lot of it. You have access to your cell phone, but like during the day, during academics, it's like 9-hour academic days. Like the days are very structured, from essentially 4:00 in the morning until 21:30 at night. And in the RTI program, you're reporting really 3 days a month for, I think, 6 months because you have pre-walks and then walks, and then you go to a 2-week. And I know that now there's some, they're reversing which 2 weeks, kind of whether you begin with 2 weeks or you end with 2 weeks. So that program is modernizing as well. But you all come together and kind of, for your class, you went through a capstone event that was 2 weeks concentrated of a really long academic day, et cetera. So it's a 7-month program versus a 5-week program. Completely same vision, prepared WO1, definitely different strategies and resources available.
Oh, very much so. I do feel like there is a big advantage if you're in Compo 2 and 3 to do the RTI.
Yeah.
And whenever I've had multiple people come and ask me about walks and which is better, should they do the RTI or should they do the active duty one? It's like I didn't do the active duty one, so I can't speak to that one. So I am biased when it comes to it. But I do feel like the RTI better prepared me for life as a TPU warrant officer, because that's really how it functions. You only get the 1 weekend a month to do whatever it is you need to do, and then you've got the 30 days or whatever between your BAs to coordinate all the actions that still need to happen outside of those 3 days or 2 days. So the RTI was, I think, prepared me for that aspect of it a lot more than 5 weeks at Novacell would have.
Yeah, that's a really great point, is that you're also talking about like pacing, not just the education that you received on like military history or doctrine and strategy, but like you're talking about an op tempo, right? The learning, I guess, that op tempo that you're sort of associated with. That's a really good point. I wanted to bring up this last thing, and I know that I've kept you on the phone probably a little bit longer than I promised. So if you still have the patience with me, I just wanted to bring up that you had brought up a motto that you've sort of absorbed and you've started using. Do you want me to refresh your memory, or do you remember what I'm talking about?
Oh, no, it's okay to fail, but never okay to quit.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
That was definitely a core memory that I have from walks. That what felt like hours in that hallway doing those Y squats was definitely now embedded in my consciousness. But
well, set the stage for people that weren't there. Explain how this situation unfolded.
The activating event that caused it is a little hazy. We were all called into this hallway, and we did something wrong, and we were told to do Y squats until muscle failure, while we were gently explained why we were wrong. So all of us that are in this hallway, we're all doing Y squats. There were a few of us, myself was one of them included, who got to the point of almost muscle failure, but instinctually we stood up to relieve kind of the pain we were feeling. And it kind of went like that for a while until you explained to us, you asked anyone, did anyone stand up? And a few of us said, yeah, we stood up. Asked, why did you stand up? I said we were going to muscle failure. And it was kind of this self-reflecting thing where you were reiterating, hey, sometimes you're going to fail, but that doesn't mean that you get to quit. So muscle failure or failure isn't necessarily a bad thing. So you can learn from that failure and grow from it the same way. Maybe if your muscles fail you, they'll just come back stronger in the end. So that's was kind of a lesson I really took from that. And it's really helped me a lot develop my personal courage as far as being in meetings. I mean, the last 18 months, I think I've probably briefed more colonels than I've ever seen the previous 18 years of my career. And being able to go into a room with those senior leaders and with confidence and tell them, this is how things should be. This is how things, this is how I think you ought to do it, and not feel like I don't know what I'm talking about is incredibly important as a warrant officer. So knowing that even if I'm wrong, being able to acknowledge that I'm wrong and grow as a person, and with that knowledge and just keep moving forward is really, really important. And I've kept with me.
Yeah. That makes me so happy, because that was something that like I shared that was meaningful for my past, like as a coach, like, and we do those spots with you. Like I hit muscle failure. Everyone is meant to have failure. Everyone is meant to grow from failure. Everyone inevitably will experience failure, but it really is that, like, I think sometimes when we're close to failure, we quit and we think that those things are the same, and being able to distinguish between, like, simply being able to distinguish between are things getting hard and am I like foreseeing the future versus did it actually happen? Did it come to fruition? It has been a big lesson in my life that also gives me courage. So I'm so proud of you. I'm like so truly proud of you, because I remember a year and a half ago, like you would just like, you were so quiet and you vigilantly took so many notes. Like you were so committed to this transition from like what you had done and probably very naturally done for years, right? Like you had accumulated so much expertise in those years, and then to really like have the courage to say like, hey, I want to do more again at a time when we don't really know what more is going to look like. It is kind of the like fear of the unknown, but we really, like, the Army conceptualizes that like good leaders are calm in that ambiguity and still make good decisions in ambiguity and sometimes in chaos. And like you are so studious about who you were becoming, not just about academic material, but about like really intentionally becoming this new version of yourself. So I just want to say that like, I'm proud to know you, and I'm proud that we've maintained a relationship. And I'm like, I was so thrilled to see that email from you and kind of hear about what this journey has been like, what this transition has been like for you.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. I have worked really hard on it.
Yeah. And it shows, you know, like, and I'm really hopeful that your unit knows how lucky they are to have you, and your soldiers, right, to know how lucky they're to have you, leading them into multi-domain operations and large-scale combat operations as a warrant officer. I think that's really cool.
It's always nice to have mentors that share a similar vision and strategy. It's nice to have those different strategies and people who have different ideas of how to do things, but it's heartening to know that there's other people, particularly mentors, who sort of are on the same page with you, so you don't feel like you're the only one and you feel like you're crazy, for wanting to do these things. So.
Right. Yeah. I relate to that. I very much relate to that. That to know that, like, because warrant officership really is so enigmatic. It's not well defined in doctrine. It's sort of like a lot of branches choose to define it for themselves. There's not really like one definition of what makes a good warrant officer. So I think it's nice also when we have this like cross branch mentorship and relationship that allows people to say like, hey, in ordnance, we do this and our problem solving looks like this, or a technique that we use this. And in intel, we use this. And, you know, in AG or in name a thing, right? There's so many different ways that we're taught to, and you mentioned we all come from different backgrounds, like different family backgrounds where we develop character and stuff. So I think one of the things that I'm most grateful for with the cohort is not having a group of subject matter experts from my own MOS, but being able to talk to like expert problem solvers and like war fighters across totally different branches and MOSs that help me think differently and more creatively.
Oh, for sure.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the email that you sent me. Thank you for taking the time and having the courage to like share the things that have worked for you so that somebody else can put them in their toolbox and use them when they're building a really solid foundation for their own warrant officership.
Well, thank you for having me. It is really nice to be able to have the opportunity to give back to the cohort, and I'm really excited going forward to really see what I can do to help influence other people as they come up through the ranks as well.
If you have any questions or feedback on what you want to hear more of the season, please email warrant.officer.history@gmail.com. As always, for updates and information, please visit the Warrant Officer Historical Foundation at warrantofficerhistory.org. I want to note that if you visit their LinkedIn page, they have published some information about if you are interested in becoming the next Warrant Officer Historical Foundation non-resident fellow for the upcoming year. And if you would like to continue the podcast, Cohort W, please check out their LinkedIn and please contact Mr. Hauser for more information. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.